When I was a student, I used to believe that architecture was just about buildings. But then I discovered Miyazaki. Not that Miyazaki. I'm talking about the other Miyazaki, the Dark Souls Miyazaki. I first played Dark Souls in 2020 and I was instantly engaged with its obtuse storytelling, the dark fantasy aesthetic, the aggressive risk-reward action gameplay, and most notably, the intricacy of its level design. But before we get into it, I want to tell you a little story about a house on a hill. The house had 40 rooms. None of these rooms were a bedroom, a bathroom, or a toilet. The house was a series of complicated spatial loops where rooms would turn and tease and twist and fold back on themselves to reveal secret and hidden pathways that would lead you back to the beginning. Imagine a sequential spiral of denial and reward. You enter the house from the street at ground level, where you are funneled through a deep, narrow hallway. At the end of this hallway, you must turn back on yourself to enter through another room where the street you just came from is now visible but distant through a window. The upper floor is visible through the ceiling and the basement is visible through the floor. A garden, hidden from the street, is now visible from the room. Another short hallway leads you to a spiral staircase that descends to the basement. The basement is a church where the garden and street above are visible through the ceiling. As you move through the main hall of the church, you are again funneled to a private garden at the back of the house where you are rewarded with a stunning view of the city from above. As you move through the garden, you pivot again and re-enter the house from a hidden door where you ascend to a dining room with a view to another garden. This garden leads you back through the house to another hidden door. This door leads you back to the very first room. You have arrived back at where you first entered the house. The room is the same, but you are different. The project was a house, a special house. It was a wake house designed to facilitate a person who is experiencing the various stages of grief. By moving through these highly calibrated spatial set pieces, the rooms were curated in such a way so as to evoke feelings of sadness, joy and hope. The house was experimental, overwhelming and complicated. Always changing, never finished. So why am I telling you about this house? Well, the house was mine. I designed it. In 2017, I completed my architectural thesis, a year-long design project every student must complete on the path to qualifying as an architect. Always in development, always in a state of flux and forever under construction. So what does this house have to do with Miyazaki and Dark Souls, and furthermore, what does any of this have to do with the title of this video? In hindsight, the house I was designing in 2017 was never really a house. It was a prop, a theatrical set, a drawing, a collection of drawings, an experiment. Let's say it was an immersive experience designed to be explored through drawings and images but never as physical space. You can look, but you can't touch. The project was bullshit. Self-indulgent non-architecture, a vanity project for my own amusement, an excuse to make pretty drawings and build fun models. It was time to move on and start making real architecture. And then, in 2020, I played Dark Souls for the very first time. As I fought my way through the early stages of the game, I had this weird feeling. Something felt familiar. I battled through the tutorial in the Undead Asylum, I arrived at Firelink Shrine, I ascended to the Undead Burg, and I fought my way through hordes of hollows. I vanished the Taurus Demon, I conquered the Bridge of the Red Dragon, and I made my way to the Undead Parish. But then, I found an elevator at the back of an old church. I rode the elevator to the very bottom and discovered that I had returned to Firelink Shrine through a hidden opening. I was back where I had started. The shrine was the same, but I was different. That's when it clicked. The level was a loop, a complex spatial loop. I get it. My thesis project was designed like a Dark Souls map. Let me explain. If I were to describe the Miyazaki Dark Souls level design methodology, it would involve the following 5 characteristics: interconnected spatial design, layered verticality, environmental storytelling, visual signposting, atmosphere. When I look back at the design of my thesis project, I see all 5. Therefore, it's obvious to conclude that in 2017, I was deeply inspired by the level designs of Dark Souls. But what if I told you that in 2017, I had never even heard of Dark Souls or Miyazaki? How could I be so deeply inspired by something I didn't even know existed? The long answer lies deep in the subconscious connections we make between our lived experience, the architecture we inhabit, and the art and pop culture that we consume. The short answer is that the inspiration existed before it existed. The short answer is the Soane Museum. The Soane Museum is an abstract prototype for modern video game design, and this lineage is what directly and indirectly influenced the design of my thesis project. It has shaped me as the designer that I am today. But to better understand how, let's talk about loops and spirals. The Soane Museum opens to the public in 1813. 198 years later, we get Dark Souls. 5 years after the release of Dark Souls, I start designing my thesis. At this time, I am unaware of Dark Souls, but I am very aware of John Soane. And I'll get to this later. In 2020, I play Dark Souls for the first time, and I discover that Dark Souls is literally my thesis. And because my thesis is heavily inspired by Soane, that can only mean one thing. Me, Soane, and Miyazaki are now three best friends, forever tied together by a looping spiral of time, space, and design. It is all connected. But how? If Hidetaka Miyazaki is the master of death and darkness, then John Soane is the master of space and light. Both design and shape not just space, but the emotional responses that those spaces can evoke. When you're playing a game, you're navigating space, sometimes in 2D, sometimes in 3D. But game space is not the same as real space. The game space is a virtual representation of a real environment. Cities in open world games are the best example of this. This is New York, but not really. It's a scaled interpretation of New York. Players don't want a one-to-one translation of space. Why? Because it's not fun. If great architecture is informing great level design, and the next generation of architects are consuming more video games than ever before, then what does this mean for the future of architectural design? So let's get it out of the way. The Soane Museum is not a video game. I know that. Dark Souls is a video game, but it is extremely Soane coded. Interconnectedness, layered complexity, and an abundance of atmospheric spatial storytelling masterfully achieved through the composition of lighting, artifact, lore, and space. Allow me to show you why the Soane Museum is the Dark Souls of architecture. The Soane Museum is architecture. In 2016, I wrote a dissertation on the Soane Museum titled The Soane Museum, an Alternative Description. 12,000 words, 200 drawings, 100 pages. I even built some models to help me better understand the museum as part of my research. My conclusion? The Soane Museum cannot be described, it can only be experienced. Describing the Soane Museum is like describing a dream, or in Miyazaki's case, a nightmare. I first visited the Soane Museum in the summer of 2015 when I was working in London as an architectural assistant. My boss at the time described the Soane Museum as London's best kept architectural secret. My mother, who is not an architect, described it as the funny house with the funny things. I've even once heard it described as spatial heroin. The problem with these descriptions is that the Soane Museum is many things to many people. So let's get into it. The Soane Museum is also the Soane House, or Soane Houses. Today, the museum is made up of 3 houses, but originally the Soane Museum was a single house. The Soane Museum, as we now understand it, is 3 houses acting as one house, and one house as living laboratory for architectural ideas and experimentation. Sir John Soane's museum officially became a public museum in 1837, 4 years after the passage of the Soane Act, 1833. For the remainder of this video, I will be referring to the Soane Museum as both a house and a museum. So in summary, the Soane Museum is many things. A house, a museum, a laboratory, a tourist attraction, an archive, and a crypt. No, really, there is a sarcophagus in the basement. Very, very Dark Souls. The Soane House is an obtuse, obscure, labyrinthian marvel, oozing an eclectic sophistication, spatial complexity, and is 3 houses and over 3 centuries worth of unadulterated architectural filth. The Soane House is incredible, and I love it. But I didn't always love it. The Soane Museum is a masterpiece, and masterpieces can be difficult. For Picasso, think Guernica. For Kubrick, 2001. You get the point. A masterpiece is both wide and deep. More significantly, a masterpiece cannot simply be understood or appreciated in its entirety at first glance. Its richness lies in its complexity, demanding patience, curiosity, and repeated engagement to fully grasp its depth. As is often the case, a masterwork's true cultural and artistic value is patiently revealed over time. It will penetrate the zeitgeist, overcome negative critical reception, and last the test of time. A masterpiece at its worst will breed imitation, and at its best inspire innovation. On first glance, a masterpiece such as the Soane Museum or Dark Souls can feel intellectually inaccessible. This is not because it seeks to exclude, but because it operates on multiple levels of intellectual artistry. The brilliance of such work is that there is no barrier for entry. The work is rich enough to be consumed through any lens in any context. My favourite example of this is The Sopranos. Come for the cliché machismo gangster tropes, stay for the multifaceted socio-political commentary on the state of post-9/11 society in America. In other words, what you are willing to see is what you are likely to get with a masterpiece. And that brings me back to Dark Souls. The Dark Souls series has 3 entries and a Bloodborne, released in 2016. Dark Souls, released in 2011, is widely considered a singular masterpiece. Sekiro was released in 2019, before Elden Ring, released in 2022, arrived to mass critical acclaim, cementing Miyazaki as the master of the open-world dark fantasy RPG genre. The series is famous, or infamous, for its grueling, punishing difficulty, but I believe this is a mischaracterization of the series. Obtuse, difficult, but massively rewarding for those who put in the effort to meet it at its level. So when I say the Soane Museum is the Dark Souls of architecture, what exactly do I mean? Both works share the spirit of a creative mind at work. The Soane Museum and Dark Souls reward you for engaging with it appropriately. They reward persistence and curiosity. The Soane House rewards patience, as its complexity unfolds only to those who linger long enough, those who examine, those who question, and those who engage deeply with its spaces and its objects. Dark Souls challenges players to overcome obstacles, making victory and understanding feel earned. The game had this special sauce and I just loved it, but it did not love me back. Dark Souls destroyed me again and again until I learned to meet it on its own terms. The game demands that you learn. It demands that you pay attention, study patterns, learn the levels. There is no map, there is no difficulty setting. The game exists as a challenge in the absolute sense. Rise to the challenge and play the game on its level, because it will not meet you on your level. This is true for all games in the Dark Souls series, and is arguably true for any challenge of a complex nature, architecture school included. I have played and beaten every game in the modern FromSoftware Miyazaki Soulsborne catalogue. Elden Ring released the week I formally qualified as an architect. What better way to celebrate than to indulge in a month-long expedition through the lands between? I return to these games regularly. Every playthrough is unique, no character role is ever the same, and I find that the rich, layered quality of the games reward me with something new upon each playthrough. But I was filtered initially, as many newcomers are. The games like to test your threshold for pain and frustration. This is usually achieved through the careful implementation of a skill check boss battle, usually within the first 2 hours of each game. It is designed to filter out players who are unworthy of the experience. The reward for persevering and overcoming the skill check is access to the actual beginning of the game. Everything else was just tutorial. A lot has been written online about how Dark Souls and its meta-narrative has single-handedly enabled people to overcome feelings of sadness, insecurity, and depression. The rush of overcoming a challenge of such a complex nature instills belief in the player that they truly can overcome anything.
I have failed in my mission, but perhaps you can keep the torch lit.
When I first visited the Soane Museum in the summer of 2015, I was filtered. I left intrigued, but generally underwhelmed. I remember thinking of the conversations I had had with my bosses, and I left the Soane Museum thinking, old man recommends old building. So what? But as time passed, I found myself thinking of the Soane house regularly, so much so that I decided to write a short 200-word description of my first visit as a warm-up exercise for my dissertation in 2016. I could not stop writing. Based on one single visit in 2015, I began to build a loose structure for what would become my dissertation and later my thesis. The plan was to describe the building twice. Once from my memory of the visit in 2015, then again upon a second visit in 2016. This way I could understand how accurate my remembered version of the project was, and to my surprise it was almost identical, with one caveat. On my second visit I had to explore the museum in reverse. Part of the museum was undergoing renovation works, so instead of entering the museum through number 13, I now had to enter the museum through number 12, therefore rearranging the sequence of exploration. To my surprise, my observations from visit 1 were just as applicable to visit 2, despite moving through and exploring the building in a reverse order. In other words, exploring the Soane Museum from a different perspective simply confirmed what I had suspected. The Soane house was not a one-trick pony, it was a magical pony. The Soane house is a unicorn. The binding characteristic of both works is arguably exploration. The Soane house is there to be explored, as is the world of Dark Souls. My biggest takeaway from this second visit was how the plan worked. For example, the Soane house is a cluster of rooms, but depending on where you're standing and where you are looking, rooms blend together visually and will likely disrupt your understanding of the floor plan. The way in which the scale of each room fluctuates and expands keeps you on your toes at all times. Tall spaces flow to narrow spaces, shallow spaces blend with deep spaces. The plan has a way of pushing you through each of its rooms. Mirrors and reflective surfaces further expand the sense of space. Coloured glass filters light and enriches the atmosphere of each room. The effect is nauseating, but in a good way. I began sketching plans based on these observations. I would draw a plan of what was visible as an overlay on the physical plan of the museum. What I noticed was that I was creating these long, abstract splays. As I created more splays, the splays would intersect. My theory was that the stronger the intersection, the richer the space would be. It turned out that despite writing over 10,000 words, the alternative description that I was crafting was in drawn form, not written form. So why does any of this matter, and what does it have to do with Dark Souls and Miyazaki? Both works share the same visual code, and that code is a spiral, where spaces expand and contract around this spiral to evoke feelings of excitement, sadness, fear, and intrigue. There is no one singular way in which you must explore these spaces. In Dark Souls, the interconnected game world reveals itself through hidden paths, shortcuts, and boundary breaks. Unlike traditional linear game design, where levels are created to be experienced in one specific order, a Dark Souls level is dynamic and versatile. Better yet, this trick actually works just as well vertically as it does laterally. The entire opening half of Dark Souls is open-ended. You can explore any part of the map in any order. This non-linear exploration mirrors how visitors might move through the Soane house, discovering hidden rooms and pathways in no specific order, yet always subconsciously developing a deeper understanding of the space. My thesis project, The House That Was Not a House, worked the same way, at least on paper. The world of Dark Souls is its atmosphere. Its world is filled with places, cities, structures, realms and rooms littered with memory and history, cryptically revealed to players through subtle environmental storytelling and signposting. The Soane house, like Dark Souls, has a distinctive atmosphere, intimate, mysterious, and sort of unsettling, especially in the basement. Very Dark Souls. Part of what makes the atmosphere so intense in Dark Souls is the art direction. As video game technology improves and develops, photorealism is beginning to emerge as an achievable graphical standard in the industry. But no level of photorealism can ever really compare to the lived experience of exploring the Soane Museum, or any building or space for that matter. To compensate, Dark Souls gets around its own graphical limitations through the masterful use of art direction. Artistic and pop cultural references can be found all over the world of Dark Souls. A reference to Caspar David Friedrich's Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog is apparent in the opening 20 minutes. The illustrations of Gustave Doré and the presence of the Great Sword from Kentaro Miura's Berserk series are just a few examples of Miyazaki referencing the art that inspired Dark Souls in Dark Souls. Both works are so vast and so rich that most people will never experience everything that they have to offer. Large parts of the Soane collection are hidden behind screens and panels. Entire levels in Dark Souls are hidden away in secret corners of the map. I would argue that Dark Souls cannot be played alone. Yes, it is a single player game in nature, but if anything, Dark Souls and the Soulsborne games have living online communities where players explore Miyazaki's worlds in detail over the course of many years. Sometimes decades. Secrets are uncovered, lore is discovered, and expert veteran players, those who have already overcome the hardships of Dark Souls, can assist new players through the summoning system. In Dark Souls, the surest way to remain hollowed is to give up. This brings me to the messenger system. Players can leave behind messages for future players who are exploring the environments for the very first time. Likewise, a player who has suffered a terrible fate can allow their spirit to remain in another player's game, therefore guiding new players through the treachery of each environment. This is the heart of Dark Souls, overcoming complex challenges as a community together rather than as an individual is the hopeful, optimistic message Miyazaki wants to convey in the backdrop of the most horrific, oppressive worlds. You can explore the Soane house for fun, on your own, during a lunch break, on a weekend. I would argue it's much more fun to study the Soane house in the context of its niche cultural appeal. There is a deep conversational quality to the Soane house. Did you find the Easter eggs? Did you count the black spots in the Hogarth collection? Did you visit during the day or did you visit during the night? The hidden mirror effects, the picture room panels, the monk's parlour, the sarcophagus in the basement, the crypt, and all of the multiple secret passageways throughout the project. Remember, I only discovered the Soane house through word of mouth. So, a building can inspire a game, but can a game inspire a building? What happens if we invert this formula and start to design architecture based on game levels? What do we get? The answer is probably a lot of houses with no toilets. Of course, the house in my thesis project never had a toilet. None of the buildings in Dark Souls have a toilet either. This wasn't an oversight on my part, it was simply a method of prioritizing and organizing a design based on evoking an emotional response from the space. Think architecture as narrative experience. The project was a provocation, not necessarily a building. And that's okay. When I was a student, I used to think architecture was just about buildings. But is a piece of architecture any less valid just because it's built in code instead of concrete? My little house on the hill was built on sketches and drawings, but in many ways it was built on the back of everything that I as an individual had consumed up to that point in my life. Architecture is human and architecture is art, even if that art is a video game. As more and more architects are raised on new media and entertainment, it is not inconceivable to think that we are on the precipice of a society that understands architecture and 3D space through video games. In other words, who cares if there's no toilet?